much for being here again another afternoon with this online colloquium. Today we have the pleasure to have Nils Karlson. He's the CEO and president of the Radio Research Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He's economist and also political scientist, and he's professor of political science at University of Linköping. Nils will discuss with us one of his last books, Statecraft and Liberal Reform in Advanced Democracies, that we already discussed last year. Thank you so much, Nils, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, pleasure to be here. I have some slides to share with you, and basically I'm going to present this book, and I think we'll have a Q&A in the end, right? So let's see if I can get these slides up here now. Is that okay? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I'll try to do this in 20-30 minutes or so. We'll see how this develops here now. So the question is, how can we promote classical liberal reforms? And it's a topic that interested me for a long time, actually. I published many books, various areas, you know, constitutional issues, educational reforms, many areas. It's been puzzling me. Many of us classical liberals know what the government should do, especially what the government should not do, I guess, you know. So we want to promote the rule of law, you know, limited government, all this, but how can we promote this? This is the big question. I don't think we have devoted enough time to this. So I wrote this book a couple of years ago on statecraft and liberal reforms in advanced democracies. And statecraft, it's something that libertarian, classical liberals have not really devoted enough time to, but it's the art of governing a country well. And I'm focusing on advanced democracies like Sweden, Spain, the United States, the UK, and so on and so forth. Not third world countries, not dictatorships, anything like this. And to run a country well in a dynamic, changing world, you need to do reforms that increase the welfare of people, right? To make society more efficient, to make society better in the views of the voters, of course, of the citizens. And at least from a Swedish perspective, but my guess that will be true in Spain as well. What we really want is liberal reforms, right? That decrease the size of government, increase liberty, and make society more free. The problem is that these kinds of reforms, liberal reforms, are extremely difficult. And they are so for three different reasons. The first reason is, as you all know, in a welfare state, there are many, many different groups who depend on the state. Pensioners, students, people who live on welfare, and so on and so forth. I would guess in Sweden, not perhaps today, but earlier, over 50% of the voters, for the majority of their income, were dependent on the state. So people are caught in this, what's called public goods traps. It's very hard to get support for something that is so collective as liberty, right? Liberty is a collective good. It's hard to promote interest, to support a good that benefits everyone in the long run. So many things that we favor take some time for them to like markets or freedom and so on. It's not a short-term benefit, it's a long-term benefit, and it's hard to get that kind of support. Also, kind of research that's been very popular with the Kahneman and others, you know, cognitive science. We do know today that there's a very strong status quo bias. There's a negativity bias that to take away things from people, they really don't want that. So it's harder to argue in favor of benefits in the long run, and it's to take away things. Also, we have what I call ideational traps. There's a great support for the idea of the welfare state, the big state, while we have not really explained why markets of free society is good. So people are caught in mental frames, how to interpret reality that is not to our favor. Lastly, of course, media logic, public opinion, what's called preference falsification. It's costly to say that the emperor is naked. If you raise your hand and say, you know, everyone will benefit from drastically decreasing the size of government, people will think you're crazy, even if you're right. So that's a high cost. So people hide their true preferences. Even if they realize that things are not working well, they don't say so because it's a social cost to do so. And I argue this is especially difficult in welfare state. So given this research, reforms, liberal reforms would not even be possible, right? But what I've done in my book is to study a couple of cases where for over 25 years, consecutive governments implemented, I would say, liberal reforms. They're not, you know, libertarian utopias or anything like that, but in both Sweden and Australia, liberty increased stepwise for over 25 years. So I'm going to tell you a bit about this story, and I'm going to present a theory that I think is applicable to Spain and to many other countries for how to do it. So this theory, it builds on previous research about institutional change and so on, but also on these two case studies. So Australia, you don't know such much about that, but it was an extremely regulated economy. Wages were set in arbitration courts, depending on what the male bread earner needed to earn. All women had lower wages by definition. It's an extremely centralized system, very protectionist, very high tariffs and so on, and border controls, very high subsidies to industries. All these changed. And Sweden, you know, the big welfare state, high taxes and so on, also liberalized. I will tell this story. So this is the first example of what happened in the two countries. It's the freedom index. I think you're all more or less familiar with that. But it measures freedom in 5 dimensions that you can see here: size of government, legal system, sound money, freedom of international trade and regulation. Sweden in the 70s was one of the most unfree countries. But in fact, it was liberalized drastically, and so was Australia. Then the curve flattens out, but reforms continued in other dimensions that I will give examples of. So this is Sweden. For 25 years, between 85 and 2010, 17 of those years had social democratic governments. Quite amazing, isn't it? A bit like your socialists in Spain. They implemented all kinds of privatizations, deregulations, tax reform, agriculture reforms, school vouchers reforms, choice in healthcare, in childcare, elderly care, and so on. Independent central bank, cutting costs in social insurance systems and so on, pension reforms, tax reforms. Sweden don't have a wealth tax, we don't have a gift tax, we don't have an inheritance tax. Taxes for private companies are very low in Sweden. Taxes for individuals, income taxes are still very high, as I will show, but they have changed. So the question is, how did they do it? How was this possible? How could all these governments, some were more right-wing or liberal, like Carl Bildt and some others, or Reinfeldt in the end here, but the others were socialists, more or less. But they liberalized Sweden. This is the example of the tax share of GDP. It's still very high, but this trend of increase in taxes changed. Australia, very different, as I said, also had 25 years of reforms. And those guys to the left, they are the Australian Labour Party people. So Bob Hawke to the left here, who was the leader of the Australian Congress of Trade Unions. He became prime minister in 1983, winning on an agenda saying we're going to restore the big old regulations and benefits and so on. He didn't do that. Instead, he implemented liberal reforms together with Paul Keating, his finance minister, who later became prime minister. Cutting down these tariffs, having tax reform, deregulating financial markets, introducing, instead of this very centralized bargaining system, firm level bargaining, more radical than in Sweden, pension reforms, industrialization reforms, well, all kinds of welfare reforms, work for the dole, as they say there, privatize the public employment agency and so on. Quite astonishing. 12 years of Labour government, then John Howard, liberal nationalist government coalition between two parties, continued the reforms for another 12 years. So this is an example that how they cut down these tariffs and protectionist measures. This is for manufacturing industry. The industry was mostly protected, and they did this unilaterally. This was not do-arounds or anything like that. They did it because the argument was this is good for consumers, this is good for ordinary people in Australia. And it was supported by the labor unions, it was supported by the labor governments. Quite astonishing. So how did they do it? That's my question. And I have this theory that I developed. This has three parts. The major part I call the reform cycle. Then we have a number of reform strategies. So I have something called polycentric learning. And I will try to explain this a little bit here. So this is the reform cycle. It starts with ideas, and I will come back to all these parts. Ideas that are promoted by policy entrepreneurs that interact with power, resources, and interests, and influence policies and institutions that in turn affect economic social conditions. That's what we want to do. We want to raise the welfare of society. Well, better lives for citizens, a freer life, right? So this is like a chain in a sense. Every part here is necessary. And it always starts with an understanding and interpretation of the world around you, the economic social conditions. It could be migration, it could be bad economic growth, it could be globalization, it could be urbanization, whatever. The key is to develop ideas that people understand and realize that this will make society better. So how you interpret your frame of mind to understand what goes on there, that's the key. That's why you need research scholars and so on to do this work. But in the end, those ideas have to be developed, and they come from many, many different sources. Here you have some well-known classical liberals, and they were important in both countries, actually. Books were translated to Swedish, for example. But also the OECD, the IMF, university professors and so on, central banks, not the least the finance ministry usually in these governments were really important here. So ideas are important, and some ideas are more important than others and easier to change. This makes a distinction between beliefs and values. That's what ideas are about. It's very hard to change the values of people. So the Swedish Social Democrats, they wanted to restore the welfare in a sense. Labour wants to promote ordinary people, but they did that with different beliefs, right? And beliefs can either be very simple things like marginal tax rate, that's instrument settings. But it can also be saying that, well, it's not taxes that benefit, an equal society or a society that's good for everyone. It's a better educational system. Then you have changed your policy instrument. That's harder. What's really hard is to change the overarching goals. And that's what happened in both these countries. The whole worldview, the policy paradigm changed. And the next step is that ideas without entrepreneurs, this is what you need in the economy. This is what you need in politics. You have to have some agents who push these reforms. So policy entrepreneurs develop, articulate ideas, facts, new perspectives, values, worldviews, and so on. Form coalitions with others. It's very important to collide with labor unions, people who don't think exactly like you, but may have the same worldview. If you as libertarians just stay by yourself and convince each other, not much fun, right? So you have to bring in other people to form coalitions. Even though they're wrong in some sense, if you push in the same direction, they're very important. And they activate and work with these power resources, and they work with reform strategies. I will return to that. So this is very important. If you as a liberal want to promote reforms, you can't do it without power, without resources. You have to get support from rich people, from industries, from abroad. Yeah, without resources, you can't affect politics. You have to get your hands dirty, in a sense. You know? If you don't do that, it's all talk. So this is the challenge. And in both countries, this happened in quite different ways. I will give some examples later on. So this is the reform cycle. I put in some more actors here around. People that can promote ideas, people that can work as policy entrepreneurs, even governmental agencies, departments can be policy entrepreneurs. Think tanks like you, of course, labor unions, and you have to activate this power resource, influence policies in parliament, change the economic social conditions, so voters and firms and others, you know, are influenced, and keep on working like this. So you can use this to understand individual reforms, but also the overall process for these 25 years. What about these strategies? This is a thing that I developed in a book, a new thing, and I distinguish between three kinds of strategies called Popperian, Kohnian, and Machiavellian. Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn were, well, scientists who were interested in understanding basically both scientific change, but also social change, political change. And Karl Popper is perhaps the most well known. That's what I do as an academic. What you do when you write reports? Well, you use scientific results, empirical studies, you argue, you try to convince people in public discussion. It's a very incremental thing. It's about changing beliefs, right? You can do it. That was not the most important thing in this reform process. Much more important were what I called Kohnian strategies. That's about framing, narratives, how you pose the question, if you want. You have to be there when things change. Now with COVID-19, for example, what are the causes here? Is it the market failure or political failures here? It's a political failure that goes on. It's not the fault of markets that people are getting unemployed. Extremely important. You have to be there and say that. If you don't open up the economy, it's the politicians' fault. It's not the fault of the market actors and so on. So this is about changing the paradigm, how you look at things. This is harder. Usually a crisis is important here. They can open up windows of opportunities, called critical junctures and so on in the literature. You have to use these opportunities. This was very important in Sweden. We had a major crisis in the early 1990s. Same thing in Australia. Without those hard crises, I don't think we could have changed the paradigm the way we did, but we did. The next one, which also I think liberals are hesitant to use, was extremely important in both countries. Many situations, you know, they won elections not by saying we're going to make society extremely liberal, we're going to lower taxes. They said the opposite. But when the politicians came into power, they kept on implementing a liberal agenda. Very, very interesting. And they did so because they understood that these reforms were beneficial, right? In the long run, people, the voters, the citizens liked the reforms because they produced good results. But that was not exactly what you said in the elections in order to win them. That's a different thing. So you have to be a bit Machiavellian. You have to use masking, indexing, delaying consequences, and so on in devious ways. Very clear. I think Sweden was more so than Australia, actually, especially the Swedish Social Democrats use this kind of policies. Don't show your real intentions. Spread the blame on others. You know, it was the other guy's fault when some bad things happen. You take the credit for the good things, but you don't take credit for the hard things that people have to go through in order to implement reforms. So to give you 3 examples, in Sweden, we had an agenda that Podemos and your present government in Spain would love, I think. We had a real socialist scheme, you know. So the labor unions, supported by the social democratic governments, had a thing called the wage earners funds. So profits in private companies were taxed, money were put into a fund that was run by the labor unions. And in 20 to 30 years, they would have taken over the majority of the ownership in Swedish industry. This was actually implemented. And the Swedish Confederation Industries became very pro-market. They were pro-business before, I would say. But they realized this is a real threat to the market economy. This is a real threat to democracy. So they started pro-market campaigns. They recruited top people. They had ice hockey player, pop stars like the ABBA girl, I don't remember well what's her name, you know, in the middle and the red jacket. Anni-Frid Lyngstad was her name. They had demonstrations. Entrepreneurs, directors for companies, CEOs demonstrated in the streets of Stockholm, because they realized that these reforms were so socialist, they were so dangerous, it would destroy the future of Sweden. They created new think tanks like Timbro. They started radio stations, started a private university, private childcare center to give examples to promote liberty, right? And it took them from 76 to 94 to abolish this. It took, well, more than 15 years of work to stop this really socialist initiative. And it was a combination of lots of studies, lots of Popperian rational argumentation, but very much examples, framing, you know, putting the question in a different way, explaining the very drastic facts that this was a really bad idea. And it succeeded. I think without these campaigns from the Swedish Confederation of Industries, we would not have liberalized Sweden the way we did. Australia, as I said, is a very different case. The most drastic thing there is, of course, the tariff cuts. They were caught in this very protectionist system. And the interesting thing is that this guy up to the right here, he was for 25 years or so in charge of the tariff board of Australia, a bureaucracy. So his role was to calculate how high the tariffs should be, that they were fine-tuned in different ways for different industries. And having done that for 5 or 10 years, he realized that this system is really crazy. So he started to write reports arguing that, in fact, these tariffs, these protectionist measures are disastrous for Australian consumers, for the Australian economy. He was heavily criticized by government for doing this, but he kept on doing it. And he was supported by academics in the Crossroad group. And then when the Labour government came into power, and there you have this guy, Bob Hawke, the guy with a smile there, he started to implement things in what's called accords, kind of income policy agreements with the labor unions and the governments. And the driving force here was actually the secretary in the Australian Congress for Trade Unions. They had understood that liberal ideas was a good thing. You can think about that in Spain to convince people with an organization like that. But they did that in Australia. Very, very interesting, I'd say. This is a Swedish tax reform. I think I should move on a little bit here. It's a more radical reform than the reform that Reagan and Thatcher implemented. Very huge reform. We took down marginal taxes from 70, 80, 90% down to 50. Capital taxes down to 30% from 70, 80, and so quite radical. Implemented by the Social Democrats. And the reform was actually proposed by what's called the Liberal Party in Sweden, which was more a social liberal party. They had that as their election platform 2 years before the reforms. And the Social Democrats said this was the most unfair proposal they had never heard of. This would be a disaster for equality in Sweden to implement such a reform. 2 years later, they made a deal with the liberals to introduce the same kind of reform. That was actually more radical than the liberals themselves had proposed, because they realized this was a bad way to have these marginal taxes if you want to promote equality or something like that. It had all kinds of perverse effect, as they argued. So they changed many things at the same time. People couldn't calculate winners and losers, and very Machiavellian strategy was used. They didn't really explain this to anyone, but they managed to push it through the parliament and to get the decision. Everyone was against. The moderate party was against, the farmers' party was against, everyone. The Swedish Confederation of Industries, that I said was so good, was against this reform because it took away deductions and so on from companies. But in the long run, it was a very good reform. So my last part in this theory of statecraft, which I think, in fact, may be the most important one. It's inspired, in a say, by Elinor Ostrom and that kind of thinking. Many of these ideas, when you do reforms for such a long time, you don't have the answers. The answers must be adapted, to the national conditions in Sweden and Australia. You have to develop your reforms while reforming, in a sense, especially if you have a crisis like now. We don't have the answers. So what happened is that you have a process of experiential learning where you experiment, you get concrete experiences, reflect on these experiences, and you change and develop your ideas. This was extremely important in both countries. But importantly, it mostly occurred in what I call the central zone. So this is a concept I've taken from an American sociologist, Edward Childs. And the central zone is kind of extended elite, if you want. Those think tanks I mentioned, some academics, people even, popular pop stars, or people who are, influential on what's considered the important thing. The central zone sets the tone, in a sense. Every country has a central zone. You just have to find it. And you have to influence those people. To convince voters in general, extremely costly, it takes a very, very long time. So in both countries, you have these central zone actors, labor unions and many others, economists and so on. They were very important here. A large number of actors were involved, not only the central decision makers, not only party leaders and politicians. Remember the reform cycle. The ideas are the central thing here. And of course, you needed liberal activists that really believed in the ideas, not only for efficiency or that it was good for consumers or something, but you believed that freedom was, in a sense, good in itself. Extremely important. So that's basically the story. We have the reform cycle, we have this reform strategy, and we have this experiential learning thing. And let me emphasize one thing. Usually when you think about reforms and classical liberal reforms, you think only about the politicians, the central government, the parties. Forget that. You have to widen the circle of people you have to interact with, how you think about ideas, policy entrepreneurs, and so on. So to summarize a little bit, last slide here. How do you promote reforms? Well, you have to analyze the economic social condition. What's happening? Is it a migration crisis? Is it an economic crisis? You have to define that. Conquer the idea arena to realize what ideas are the most important to interpret what goes on out there. And of course, from my perspective, liberal ideas. I really believe that's true. That's what our societies need. You have to promote policy entrepreneurs, many of them, different kinds of them. They don't have to think exactly the same thing. Form coalitions with others. Invest power resources. Without resources, nothing will happen. And dare to use all these kind of reform strategies. It's a long run thing, but it has a great potential. So thank you. Be happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you so much. It was extremely interesting. Right now, we are going to start with the questions or comments that the people that is here in Zoom will have. I don't know if any of you wants to start, but feel free to open the micro and the camera so Nils can at least see you and ask whatever you wanted to ask to Nils.
I want to join.
Yes.
Go ahead, Diego.
But I'm going to have to remove myself from the room because my baby is making a lot of noise. But I hope you're all doing great. And I just wanted to ask Nils, do you think that a new reform cycle geared towards expanding economic freedom could be in the cards for Sweden right now? Or do you think that most of these reforms have been embedded into the system, but it will take some time to have another maybe big wave of liberal reforms in your country?
It's a very good question, and I've been given a lot of thought to it. Actually, we've seen a backlash not only in Sweden but in most other countries, I think, to liberal ideas and liberal reforms. Since in Sweden, I think the reform process ended in 2010. Since then, it's been confusion, a very confused situation in Sweden and very nationalistic tendencies. We have an anti-immigration populist parties called the Swedish Democrats, very bad guys. In Australia, the reform process ended already in 2007. And since then, I think they've had 8 prime ministers and they're all bad, you know, it's pretty bad. So in Sweden, I think at least the immigration crisis were badly handled by our side. The COVID, this Corona crisis, I think it's an open question. So we will see a increase of government, public expenditure will of course rise, we'll see a rise of taxes. But at the same time in Sweden, I find it extremely interesting that the Social Democrats who are now in power have not implemented lockdowns. In fact, they've said more or less, you know, let's be liberal, let's people decide for themselves. We trust in you guys, handle social distancing by yourself. So I think if I and others in Sweden can use this narrative to really say what I hope will be a successful strategy. I think the Swedish strategy is more successful than the lockdown strategies, at least. Maybe that could be a trigger for a new liberal reform process, because we do need liberal reforms in many areas. We've seen the opposite actually for the last 10 years. It's stepwise, regulations have come back, choice in healthcare, education and so on has been limited in various ways. Taxes have been raised and so on. So I've been quite pessimistic for some time, but I see a little bit of light here, you know, that we could use at least. But it's hard. You never win as a liberal. I always say this. I mean, it's climbing the hill, you know, all the time. But you have to like that. I kind of like it myself. I find it nice to struggle, you know. It gives me meaning in life. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nils, and sorry to interrupt you, but I know that Fernando wanted to say something.
Sure.
Hi, Nils. Nice to meet you, and thank you for your presentation. While you were speaking, we were talking also in the chat about what has happened in Spain. And we have found that, surprisingly, even if we think that Spain is not such a liberalized state, we could see that the graphic of evolution according to the freedom, I mean, the same graphic you put for Sweden and Australia would be more or less the same for Spain, without the need of these kinds of things you seem to require in Sweden and Australia. And we were thinking that maybe there is another string of possible explanations for liberalizing I
understand.
For reforms to make it freer, that was related to the fight between institutions. I mean, I could say that most of the reforms that have happened in Spain, that has made Spain a freer country, were related to entering European Union and later to entering the euro. And in fact, what we saw, Diego was providing the data, was that it peaked, the freedom of Spain peaked precisely just before joining the euro. And also most of the reforms were done in order to enter the European Union. So what we see there is like kind of a fight for institutions, institutional competition, if you want to put it that way, that make these reforms go ahead. Do you think that something similar may have happened or may explain part of the trend in Sweden and Australia?
Well, in the Swedish case, I think Sweden joined the European Union in 1995. And I think just like Spain or Eastern Europe, that process was very beneficial for Sweden. And in Sweden, the case of Sweden, I think especially the role of law, strengthening the role of law, the independence of courts, of the judicial systems, could not have happened without the European Union. So that was important. Also, I think we kind of realized, that we're part of a larger system. We're not that unique as we think, and we could learn from others. So I think for a long time, just like for Eastern Europe, for Spain, for Portugal, the European Union was extremely beneficial for the increase of liberty. I'm afraid that has changed. I'm very critical to the social dimensions and the new social pillar and the many things that goes on in the European Union that I find problematic today. Not as problematic as the Brits think, but I still think we can do we could do things about it. But we need to do that. It's kind of centralization process that I think has gone too far and in wrong areas. In a sense, I think the European Union should be like, the minimal state, upholding liberty and constitutional rights and civil and private, liberties in various ways. But the rest we should leave for institutional competition, as you mentioned as well, between different ways of handling welfare state arrangements and labor market arrangements and so on. I'm very critical to having a common, minimum wage, for example, in the European Union. I think would be a big problem, But that said, of course, globalization, digital technologies that was affected all countries have so far been very good for liberal reforms. The possibilities for inefficient governments to exist in the world has decreased. But then we see this backlash with nationalism and populism and so on. You even have left-wing populists, but that's I think is the main challenge today, that we as liberals, it's a current project I'm working on, have not really understood how important identity, meaning, collective identity, and so on are to people, and we haven't provided an alternative in a globalized world. So I think similar tendencies when you made reform, labor market reform some years ago, when you had this debt crisis. That was very interesting. That would not have been possible without the crisis, I think, for example. So one has to take the opportunity when it comes, in a sense, and be prepared. It's very important. Yeah.
And going on with what you have just said, and consequent, I mean, what we have seen is like a process of increased centralization, in which, you know, the carrot was you will get more wealth, you will get more free. Of course, it comes a moment in which you have to render some competencies to European Union, and now it becomes a wider geography for exercise the power. In that context, what do you think of the Brexit? Because that could turn around, you know, the trend.
No, I think it may go the other way. Actually, it's I'm very sad that the UK is leaving. The UK has been the best friend of Sweden in the European Union for a long time. It's when the UK is gone, there's a risk that the centralist tendencies that France and others, you know, are promoting will increase. In fact, so it's also, I mean, it's too much. If France and Germany decides what to do, they will have the power to do it now. You know, when the UK was in, quite a large country, large vote share in the union, the power will shift, you know, and Italy, yep. We don't know, and you know, it's a new situation, and it's not a good situation.
Yes, but it could act also as a competition, institutional competition with the European Union.
It could, but I think the UK will lose from it as well. You know, I think it was a bad decision, very populist move. But we'll see, of course.
Well, sorry, Nils. We have a small delay, and
sure.
Cool. So I have a question myself. It is surprising, and I know that you also highlight this in your book, how the same reform taken from leftist or right-wing parties will have a totally different response from the citizens. So my question is, what do you think we can do with this as a libertarians? And if that's one of the reasons why you think it's important to find coalitions with very different kind of actors and people?
Well, it's some reforms, and there has been research done on this. For example, labor market reforms are harder for right-wing politicians to implement, you know. If left-wing governments implement labor market reforms, they're more, well, legitimate somehow, you know. But in general, I think it's all governments face the same challenges. If they want to, I think, in a sense, you know, most politicians want to make good decisions that are good for the citizen. I think, you know, but many of them have the wrong ideas. And you can convince even you know, left-wing people that, for example, as in Australia, that ordinary citizens, consumers would benefit from taking away all these tariffs and protectionist measures. The support didn't come from industry. It didn't come from private companies, because they were all, you know, pro-business. They weren't pro-market. So you really have to focus on winning the battle of ideas, but also to communicate those ideas, you know, of course, so they become influential. And to get some key people on the finance ministry and the central bank, in important institutions like that, to support your ideas. And also, I would argue, you know, to influence the OECD and the IMF and people like that, you know, organizations like that, the European Union, of course, is extremely important in this situation. And I think the whole setup there with this commission and the parliament is not very well balanced. It's we would need a constitutional reform in the EU, but that's not going to happen, I'm afraid. So it's that's a big challenge. But you can change things. That's my message. It's not. And also, when policies fail, that's a good opportunity. You have to explain when policies fail. That's your chance to get in there. That's why you need to study, to do this research and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for everything, for all the presentation. My question is on the same way that Irune's question is about windows of opportunity and the importance of windows of opportunity, because the cases that you study in the book, Sweden and Australia, I think they need time to change the central zone partially, to improve and to put in action all the reforms. And this is the first question. Are the windows of opportunity important or not so much, or not too much? And the second question is, as think tank here in the Juan de Mariana Institute, we are really interested in the strategy, which is the best strategy in your opinion, no? Because it is necessary to adapt to adapt the strategy to the central zone. Mm-hmm. And in that case, are we talking about a Machiavellian strategy? If we adapt our strategy to the central zone, we are Machiavellian or not?
Machiavellian strategies are basically used by politicians in parliament, I would say, when they're going to implement these policies and get them through parliament. You as a think tank, I think, should be very Conian. You should really, really try to make people understand that markets, a free society, is the best way of organizing Spain. Not to have, taxes, subsidies, the redistribution and these kind of things. It won't benefit ordinary people. It won't have good consequences. So that's the key, that to combine Popperian, Conian things. But maybe you could be Machiavellian, for example, to collide with other people who, let's give Sweden did a very important reform in the agriculture sector before we entered the European Union. Unfortunately, that reform was destroyed when we came into the European Union, because all the subsidies came back from the EU instead. But it was a very interesting coalition between housewives in a southern suburb to Stockholm who demonstrated in the streets about the high prices for food. Neoliberal, libertarian professors of economics argued that the system was a corporativist system, full of special interests benefiting each other, the industry, the farmers and all this, and the government colliding with regulators, that they also captured the regulations. People at the finance ministry doing long-term forecasts for the economy and so on. They did special studies on agriculture policies. So there was a kind of coalition here, different interests from different value perspectives, I would say, but with same beliefs, saying that in fact these regulations, these subsidies we have in agriculture sectors are disastrous for consumers. The prices are too high, it's not good for Swedish citizens. So that, became very forceful. And in fact, we implemented those policies despite, very strong defense, of course, from the farmers and all their organizations and all that, and the political parties that was supported by the farmers. Then we entered the European Union, we got the whole thing back, you know. So it's strategy is a hard thing. I mean, one can't do everything. One has to focus on certain areas, of course. But be a bit strategic which kind of areas you focus on. But I wouldn't only do economic things, you know. I think one should combine, you know, democracy-oriented things and freedom-oriented culture things, you know. To win people in the culture sector, part of the sector, so extremely influential if you can do that. To have major authors or novelists, you know, to support you or to come to your conferences and present things. And in a sense, all people in Sweden, they're all leftists, you know, but in reality, they're all private entrepreneurs, you know. They live in a very entrepreneurial society, and you know, it's but they don't understand this. They don't know this, so it's soccer stars, you know, all kinds of famous. You have to be a bit smart, you know. But I don't have the answer to this. In that case, we would live in the most liberal world, but a little bit Machiavelli, I think, could help, you know, in that sense. Not to be too afraid to interact with people that are not exactly like you. And that would be an advice from my side, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Paco, I think it's your turn, if I'm not mistaken.
Hi, Nils. Thank you very much for your book and for your presentation. I have several questions or comments.
Please.
The first one is, how is it to be a classical liberal in a country that actually works and it's more or less a social democracy? So it's like a functional democracy. Because we in Spain, we can say that we're classical liberals or libertarians, but we don't live in a country that actually works in what the state provides or what the state regulates. But all the social democracies, the Scandinavian ones, Australia, New Zealand, they are very high in the freedom indexes, and they are wealthy societies without much social conflict. So I can see that you will probably see problems, but from our position, you live almost in paradise or things like that. Also, your examples are Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian. So have you studied about, okay, is there something there in that culture, in those people that makes it easier to promote and apply these reforms and make them successful? What about Latin countries? What about Spain, Italy, France? Will there be more problems? Do you think there's no relationship? Because actually in Spain, I think we have a very high political polarization right now. So the left hates the right and the right hates the left. And there are extreme versions of both, of the left and the right. So there is a lot of political tension, and that is not healthy. I think I do not know whether it is true, but the Scandinavian countries look like very quiet, like everyone is very reasonable. You can be a little bit more to the left or more to the right, but without extremes. I don't know whether you agree with that. And the last thing is the big issues. How do we deal with the big issues, which are probably harder to reform because much more people have interests there, and there's a lot of money involved. It's the things that compose a higher percentage of the budget, which is pensions, health, and education. What do we do with those?
Okay. When I was a student and at the University of Uppsala, Sweden this was in the 1980s. Sweden had enormous economic problems, so we were a bit like Portugal a few years ago. We had very high, extremely high. We had the share of GDP of public expenditures were 73%. 73%. I think that's, communist country almost, We had extreme conflicts in politics. It was, people like us taking the fight and very bluntly taking the fight. And we were hated. We were portrayed in the press as really evil people, and only caring about money and profits and, yourself and not thinking about others or communities or whatever, you know. So we had a very hard, it's very important. I haven't emphasized that enough, you know, and it seems like both Sweden and Australia were consensus oriented. They weren't. So when these reforms took place, there was intense political discussions, conflicts, and so on. But perhaps not as bad as in Spain today, or in the US today, or in the UK today, or something, you know. Sweden, I would say, still, we still, you know, treated others with respect, in a sense, as even if you're wrong, we respected your as a person who means well and are sincere and so on. That has changed in many countries, which is extremely problematic, I think, you know, and that's why these populists have come up all over. But it's important, you know, we have this very, and when you say, you know, I mean, it's really, in the early 1990s, for example, we had interest rates of 500%. It was like a banana republic, Sweden, you know. But we changed it. That's the unique thing. We managed to get out of that very problematic situation in this process I've tried to explain. So I think it's possible for other countries. I think it may be harder in countries that, I mean, Sweden and Australia are both high trust countries. So if you look on figures from the World Value Surveys and so on, we have social capital in that sense is very strong in these two countries. But it's the same in Denmark, it's the same in Finland. They didn't have the same kind of process, but they also reformed, I would say, you know, but not in the Swedish way, not as radical in the Swedish way. When I was writing the book, I had the ambition actually to make a case of Argentina and Portugal as well, but I didn't have the energy or time to do it. You know, it took a lot of effort to learn anything about Australia actually. But someone should do that. It's important to realize why Argentina always fails, for example. Do they lack all these things that they say are so important? I know people in Argentina, you know, they have policy entrepreneurs, they have think tanks, they have, you know, huge Austrian economics society there, you know, but they always fail, you know, and it could be that Sweden and Australia, we have a very long tradition, even though we have a social democracy and all this, a big government, high taxes, we always have had through history, well, very individualistic culture in a sense, you know. So we never had a feudal system in Sweden, really. So all through the ages, the farmers, the individual farmers were represented in parliament. So we had 4 estates, you know. We had the clergy, we had the bourgeoisie, and the military, and the farmers, individual farmers. So and Australia is made up of convicts, you know, coming from the UK. So it's also a very, they never had a nobility there either. While countries like yours or South America with the big estates, you know, very strange combination of big landowners and militaries, but all countries are different. I can't see why it shouldn't be possible in your country as well. It may be harder, but definitely possible. But I don't know how. You have to know the local conditions and work with the right people. I don't know if you answer all your questions, but I tried at least.
Thank you. Yeah, you use the term, I forgot, the social capital. I also wondered, well, Australia and Sweden, all the Scandinavian countries, the population is not that high, around 10 million, more or less, and they are ethnically and culturally very homogeneous, much more homogeneous than other countries. So I don't know whether that helps. And my other questions were about the big reforms in the big issues, the ones that have more of the budget. Pensions, which are always, in Spain, we say they are always defaulting or reneging or changing. Health and education, which are essentially, with the demographic curve changing, they're going to be big issues.
Let me make a brief comment about this homogeneity thing. Sweden used to be very homogeneous. Now we're one of the most pluralistic countries in the world, or in Europe at least. So 20% of the people living in Sweden were born in another country. It's higher than the US, it's higher than the UK. It's a very high figure, actually. So that has changed since the 1990s and onwards. When it comes to big reforms, in this process, we did the big reforms, I would say. So in the crisis in the early 1990s, it was a very severe crisis, you know. There was a commission set up, led by senior, very influential economist in Sweden. A commission with a leading political scientist, some other economists, other scientists, basically. And they made a list of 100 reform proposals. And some of them were implemented by, center-right government with Carl Bildt in the early 1990s. Then the Social Democrats came back into power, and they started to implement the same reforms. And the first was a budgetary reforms, basically saying that Sweden over the cycle should make a surplus with 2%. And we've done that since then, you know. So Sweden has a public debt of 30% coming into this crisis now. So we don't have a problem at all to spend all this money to save us from Corona, you know. We have the money. So the budget reform, very important reform. We straightened up the whole budgetary process. We did a pension reform in 1997. It's described in the book, actually. And that was a consensus reform. That's an exception, you know. Through Popperian strategies, research reports, and so on, leading people in the major parties realized that a pay-as-you-go pension system, where the working population pays for the elderly, is not sustainable in the long run, because you tend to overspend, you know. In fact, the former system Sweden had, the pay-as-you-go system, gave benefits to the voters that were a lot higher than they would pay. So they pushed the cost, you know, to future generations. That was changed. And now we have a reform that is sustainable. People complain about the system today because they think the pensions are too low, but they won't get out of hand. They can't run amok, you know. So Sweden, it's worth studying that reform, and there's an international literature about pension reforms. So there has been studies done about this, and it's possible to do these reforms, and we did them. And in that case, I think you needed to get people in the central zone I discussed, you know, to realize that this is in the long run interest of our country to do these kind of reforms. And it happened. And Australia, I would say, a similar kind of process, you know. The funny thing about Australia is that the Labour Party took credit for the reforms. Even though the reforms were hard and costly in the short run, the Labour Party said, we do this because it's good for our members, for the consumers, for ordinary people in Australia. In Sweden, the Social Democrats never really said that. They said that we have to do this to save the country because the bad guys on the other side have screwed things up, you know. But of course, they realized that these reforms were necessary, and they didn't change the former reforms that had been implemented. So to everyone's surprise, the reform process continued. I was very surprised at the time, I remember, but in hindsight, I think it's maybe a little bit thing, you know, that the Social Democrats in Sweden had been in power for over 40 years, you know, from the 30s up until the 70s. So they, in a sense, believe, and they still do, that they own Sweden in a sense. They own the Swedish state. They are the state upholding party in a sense, you know. So they, by definition, take a long-run perspective on things. If they realize that healthcare educational system doesn't work, they usually, you know, realize we have to do something. Not just being short-run and opportunistic and so on. So that may be, but that changed. Now, I mean, now it's a 25% party or even less, you know, so it's, but it's not that bad to be a classical liberal in Sweden. I think it's kind of enjoying because you meet a lot of resistance, and but you have to like that, of course. And we do have a tradition with Wicksell and Kassel and LIF Heckscher, among the others. We had a classical Swedish tradition, but that was a long time ago. Yeah. Any more questions?
I think Fernando wanted to say something.
Yeah, okay, I have just retired my question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But anyway, I because you know the topic has gone for other places, and I didn't think my question pertinent anymore. I was wondering about one thing you said in your previous intervention when you referred to the opportunity of making reforms when the current policy fails. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean. That's, of course, should be the way ahead. But what we are finding currently is, for example, just thinking about the current environment and the current trend, what we see is that the pandemics has been dealt with by governments in general very bad way. But the fault is not on the governments. The fault is on the globalization and on the, you know, for example, the cuts of the health of the public health systems. Whenever you think that, for example, the previous economic crisis, the fault was not on the governments creating money; it was on the regulation of the financial system. So, whatever the reason, you end up always with a ideological fight even before you can start doing, I don't know, the theoretical analysis that show that this policy fails because of that, and now you should do this other thing. Whenever you reach there, the ideological battle is already engaged. And in order to win, it's not a matter of showing that theoretically you are right or you have improved right. You need to go ahead with all of resources just to reach the public opinion, fight against the other guys who happens to be more resource, who happen to be normally better founded than you. They have the resources because the government is normally behind them in support their position. So it's like, oh my God, it's not possible, because if you were in an ancient and would you say natural science, then you can shoot the test. Everyone can test the results by themselves. So you could convince it, but in our case, we are talking about social science. So the proof is not that hard at all. And it becomes an ideological battle. In fact, it becomes what Kuhn calls a fight of paradigms. You just do not have to change, you are not able to show them the data. You need to change the whole way they think about it, but already engage, you know, in this asymmetrical battle in which they have all the resources because they have the taxes, and you just have, you know, the fees of the members of the Juan de Mariana. So any I think would be very helpful.
No, but this is my challenge. I mean, what you're really saying is that this status quo bias that I had on my second or third slide is so forceful in Spain, you know. The special interests, all these public good traps, the idea traps, the negativity biases, the public opinion things, the media, everyone favors status quo, right? And that's always the case, you know. That's the situation we as liberal face all over the world. So you have to find ways. You have to be very proactive there when something happens, like globalization or COVID-19 or something. You have to be there quickly. You have to devote your resources to explain that this is not caused by free markets or globalization. This is caused by something else, right? Of course, the virus in this case comes from China or somewhere, you know, but how we handle it, That's the responsibility of the politicians in Spain. And if they screw it up, it's their responsibility, but you have to explain that. And I realize it's not easy. I mean, it's the same thing in Sweden, of course. We have exactly the same challenge, you know, but I think we're a little bit more we have a little bit more resources and established institutions like my own institutions and some others that take the fight and aren't afraid to take the fight. You know, it's not easy to be there when the wind is blowing and all the government agencies and experts say you're wrong or something. But if you're right, you're right. That's and also you have this problem that liberal reforms and what we see, markets and so on, freedom, is long run things, you know, while handing out subsidies or regulations, whatever, we give short-term direct benefits. So it's, but I think, you know, in this situation, I think many people in your country and France, for example, and also in Sweden, they're very fed up with the government, you know. It could be a chance for you. The reality is out there. You have to interpret it. You have to take your ideas and win this battle, you know.
Okay, thank you.
We have a couple of more questions from Zoom, and then we are gonna make a couple of questions from YouTube. Trying not to take much of your time, Nils. I'm gonna be one of making questions from Zoom, and I have 2 questions, but if you think it's too much, you can either choose one of them. The first question is why Sweden is normally claimed as a socialist paradise, or at least as a socialist country or social democratic country, and if you think that's fair, that's true. And the other question that is not related to your book, but I think it kind of makes sense because of the situation, is that you have been a big supporter of how Sweden has fight the virus, and you have said that you think that maybe more countries will take this the same strategy in the following months. And why do you think this is the case? And if you can explain to our wider audience, because more or less the audience we have at Juan de Mariana is, apart from Spaniards, also people from Latin American countries.
I think that those 2 questions are connected, actually. So I'll try to answer them. I mean, it's Sweden, in the eyes of other countries, of socialists in the USA and in the UK and many other countries, think that Sweden is a socialist country. It's not. We never socialized industry, for example. It's always been a capitalistic society. So in contrast to the Soviet Union, for example, we didn't socialize industry in Sweden. You did in France, you did in Spain and so on, the nationalized industries, banks and so on. Banks have never been nationalized in Sweden. They've always been private banks. But what we did, we socialized the traditional role of the family in Sweden. So the welfare state was a socialization of women in a sense, you know. So women works in the public sector with healthcare, elderly care and so on, doing basically the same kind of job as they did privately in houses. That may be good in some senses. I'm a big fan of the rights of women, you know, and their independence and liberty and autonomy and so on. And I think we have some good institutions there in Sweden, you know, when it comes to child leave and child support and all this, that actually is good for women and for men in the long run. But it's not a socialist country, and all these reforms did, I think, except 3 areas. We liberalized almost everything, and I've been engaged in this. I worked on this for decades. We didn't deregulate the labor market. The labor market is still very regulated. It's all collective agreements, labor unions, very high minimum wages, secure on the job legislation. We didn't deregulate the housing market. So we have rental controls and so on. We didn't manage to lower the personal income taxes in Sweden. So we have very high taxes on incomes, personal incomes. Taxes for companies are very low. We don't have much regulations anywhere. Shops are open all days, anytime you want. Pharmacies are privatized. Everything is privatized, more or less. Sweden is a very market-oriented, individualistic society, but the picture in the world is the opposite. I'm trying to change that picture. I think it would be very much better for Sweden if people around the world looked in Sweden and say, wow, that's a liberal country. So this coronavirus have given me the chance to explain this to the world, that, a country that people believe are very socialist, in fact, is not that socialist. So the way we're handling this corona crisis by, having social distancing more on a voluntary basis, letting restaurants, bars, businesses, public transportation to be open, schools to be open. That's liberal, of course. And I think it's important to explain this to the world. And these policies are implemented today by social democratic government, by the support by some non-socialist parties, of course. But it says something about Swedish society. I don't think we would accept the kind of lockdowns that you are experiencing in Southern Europe. Swedes in general will say crazy. You can't decide like that over us. I mean, we're independent people, we're citizens. We have this long tradition that I said before, people wouldn't take it. So I'm surprised. We would make a revolution if something like that would happen. That's happening to you guys. So we're not socialists. And that's why I try to explain this, that the Swedish strategy, you never know. It's an open question what's going to happen to total deaths and so on. But the economic, social costs of closing down the economy and societies are enormous. I think the political cost will be extremely high. It will support, the wrong kind of parties in the long run. It will create all kinds of social problems that will be disastrous for us. So that's the reason. But also, I think that the people who are in charge of this strategy in Sweden, which are not politicians, we have a division of power between the bureaucracy, the Swedish Health Authority, and the politicians. So the politicians don't make the decision. The decisions are made by the experts, and they more or less saying that, come on, keep schools open, keep the society open, but keep social distance. That in the end will augment immunity in the population. That meaning that the second, third, fourth wave that people who are closed down drastically probably will have won't happen in Sweden. So what I'm saying is that in 3 or 4 years, we can assess the total cost, direct costs in deaths and everything, but also the indirect costs in deaths and everything for this crisis. And I think Sweden will come out well. And it's a liberal way of doing things, not a statist way.
Thank you so much. Rafa, I think you are the last question in Zoom. So go ahead.
Hi Nils, thanks for your presentation. I'll try to be short. For winning the center, how important you reckon is to have in your side, or at least not very against you, the culture world? The culture world meaning, actors, musicians. Yeah. Because I always been shocked by your country, because it's amazing. So of course you have the classic stuff like Roxette and ABBA, and then you had really good rock bands in the 90s that they were very important as well in Spain, like the Helicopters, the Backyard Babies. So and then at the same time, pop bands that they were selling a lot of records like the Cardigans and things that I don't like at all. So it was a very broad market from an artistic point of view. So targeting even niche areas. So I think one of the reasons that maybe you succeed on winning the center is because you have such a big area where the culture is not just conquered by a specific sector that, for example, in Spain, it's heavily subsidized. So that was it. Thanks for your call and the presentation.
That's am I still on? Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, it's something that's discussed in Sweden. How can we have this success, you know, with pop music and exporting all these bands and well, Max Martin and other writing all these hits all over the world and so on. And some people say it was the public schools that we had some musical schools that all children for free could go and play the recorder and stuff like that, you know. But I would say it was ABBA, you know, and some other bands that really showed people that, or some private entrepreneurs that supported them and made them into a success. Then others have followed, you know. So it's it created a kind of musical cluster in Sweden with lots of competences and not at all supported by government, I would say. So it was extremely market oriented and Sweden has, I think it's important to understand, Sweden has always, we never had subtitles, you know, or we always had subtitles. So speakers spoke English, you know, we never dubbed films or interviews on television or anything, you know. So everyone in Sweden more or less speaks good English and understands English. So that's also one reason. We could go into this global market, you know, and also get information and so on from the global market. So that may be one reason. Swedes travel a lot as well. Well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions from YouTube. I think I'm gonna read both. First one is, do you think that the democracies in the world have the tendency to the left theories, and this can be a reverse to the goals that the world achieved in the last 2 centuries? And the other question will be, were there some think tanks or political leaders who were key in both cases you present promoting these changes?
Let's start with the last one first, because that's easier, I think. In Australia, no, there was not a think tank that was really important. There was a group of economists called the Crossroad Group, Wolfgang Kasper and some other people. And they, you know, were interacting with, I met those people, I've interviewed them, and they say that some of them explained economics to the Labour Party leaders, for example, and maybe they did. But you didn't have think tanks at those times in Australia. In Sweden, you did. So the Swedish Confederation of Industries, they supported think tanks, they supported private universities, they supported private initiatives like that. And in those days, it was extremely controversial, you know. So all of media, politicians and so on really portrayed them as evil persons, you know, that stood for these capitalist ideas, you know, because the whole media landscape, the whole public discussion was very leftist at that time. But they won in the end. So people on the left really believe that people on the classical liberal side have won in Sweden, even infiltrated the Social Democrats. But now we've seen this backlash in the last years, and now I don't know where it's going to go. You know, it's a bit of open question, but there's possibility we could develop things in the right way. The first questions, I didn't really know I understood the question, but I think it was something like, what do I think about the future of democracy, right? We've had 200 years of democracy. Is this a sustainable system? I would say it's an open question today. I've been very engaged in trying to fight populists, and I think it's extremely important. And you have some left-wing populists in Spain. Those are bad guys, but I think the right-wing populists are worse, to be honest. So we really have to take fight with people that we thought were our friends, in a sense. I have lots of friends who turned out to be nationalistic populists, authoritarian people. So they're not my friends anymore. I have to take those fights, It's very, very important. I don't even collide with them, to be honest. I think it's very important to keep the distance to this kind of people. And they're all over, They're all over. So it's problematic. They infiltrate other major parties as well. So I think what you see, I guess some of you are familiar, Timber in Stockholm, a think tank Timber in Stockholm has an index, the Timber Populist Index. It's a very good index, actually. And they say that 25% or so of the governments in Europe before Corona had populist authoritarian parties in government. I think it's worse in a sense. I think these populists have influenced former center-right parties, social democratic parties, and this is, I think, the most important ideological fight we have to take today, actually, to save democracy in the free world.
Thank you so much. We have one more question from YouTube, and it is if you can elaborate a little bit more about the response from unions and in general workers or pensionists about these reforms that you were explaining.
In Sweden, the labor unions fighted all these reforms. They were dead against all the time. But the social democratic leadership promoted the reforms. The people who were influential, like the finance minister, he supported reforms. The prime minister, after the crisis in the 1990s, supported the reforms because they realized that this would be good for the Swedish economy, this would be good for job creation in Sweden, this would be good to get rid of the huge budget deficits, the big public debt that we had at those times. So, but the labor unions were against in Sweden. In Australia, it was the opposite, as I said. It's very interesting with Australia that the Australian Congress of Trade Unions were, in fact, a policy entrepreneur supporting, advocating these kinds of reforms. Sometimes they got some subsidies and stuff like that, side payments to support them, but in the general trend that they supported for a long time, up until 2007 or something like that. Now they're bad leftist labor unions as the standard kind of union people, but they weren't for a long time, actually. Ordinary people, Sweden has had a fantastic development of real wages. So even after some very good tax reforms that have been made in the last 10 years, I think average workers in Sweden, the real wage have increased by over 60% in Sweden since the mid-1990s. And if you compare that to the US, it's enormously good. I think Australia has similar figures. So in fact, these reforms, and it's very important to explain this. I try to do it all the time in the press, actually, in Sweden. These reforms have been very good for ordinary people. The left and the labor unions tried to portray it in a different way, saying that social divisions are increasing and, the rich are getting richer and so on. But in fact, ordinary people have benefited enormously from these reforms. And you have to get the figures. You have to really do the research to get this out. Because that's the truth in both countries, I would say.
Well, thank you so much. I think we are done. I don't know if any of you have a last question, but if not, I think we can finish here. So I have just say thank you so much for being here. It was such an interesting talk. And I hope that at some point we can meet in person in any other place.
Without Corona, right?
Without Corona, yeah, for sure.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. It's been a pleasure. Very good questions, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye.